So we've been going back and watching movies about simulations and that kind of thing. And that brought me back to the movie The 13th Floor from 1999. And I was thinking that we could talk about it and use the two truths as a kind of skeleton structure for the discussion.
Well, that sounds great.
So I feel like it was a really popular movie at the time, and I guess maybe it came before The Matrix. It's kind of interesting that they both came out in the same year. And The 13th Floor was a pretty big movie. It grossed almost $12 million in U.S. theaters and had a multi-million-dollar budget. And it's kind of strange that, the director and the main actor are virtually unknowns in comparison with the size of the film. I hadn't known their names until I looked it up. Joseph Rusnak directed it, and the main star is Craig Bierko. I guess Craig Bierko had a good stage career, but I wonder how they ended up with this multi-million-dollar budget, who advertised it that much to turn it into, such a huge film.
A huge film that, in some sense, has faded into obscurity if you compare it with The Matrix.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, part of that is that The Matrix is part of a trilogy.
Right. So, well, I'll just grab the story from IMDb. I'll quote Danny Rosenbluth here. This is the story of The 13th Floor. Computer scientist Hannon Fuller has discovered something extremely important. He's about to tell the discovery to his colleague, Douglas Hall, but knowing someone is after him, the old man leaves a letter in the computer-generated parallel world his company has created, which looks like the 30s, with seemingly real people with real emotions. Fuller is murdered in our real world the same night, and his colleague is suspected. Douglas discovers a bloody shirt in his bathroom, and he cannot recall what he was doing the night Fuller was murdered. He logs into the system in order to find the letter, but has to confront the unexpected. The truth is harsher than he could ever imagine.
It's definitely supposed to be 1937.
Right.
And I actually quite like the decor. I like the Art Deco. I watched it with someone, and she really was just in love with the aesthetics.
Right. I've mentioned before I'm a huge fan of Art Deco, so I really feel the same way. So in my book, I took a kind of Eastern thought approach to the film, particularly with Ken Wilber's holon holarchy concept. I mean, you have the hierarchy of holons, the holarchy, and then even the title of the film, The 13th Floor, you get the idea of floors, like levels. So my main idea was that the film depicts a holarchic situation. And I want to talk a little bit about that here, but I want to just focus on a few other things, put a little bit more focus on some other things. And if someone wants to check out the holarchy thing, well, I think we'll talk about it a little, but they can also check it out in the book, The Two Truths.
Right. And we also have an in-depth discussion of holarchy in part 1 of our podcast on Twin Peaks: The Return.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe if we talk about it a little here, that'll act as a kind of introduction for that episode.
Okay.
Okay, so the IMDb synopsis was spoiler-free, but I really have to spoil the movie in order for us to talk about it. So, spoiler alert. The 13th Floor tells the story of Douglas Hall, a sort of virtual reality creator who is in the year 1995 working on a computer simulation of the world of 1937. People, as what are called users, can dive into the fully immersive VR and control a person in the 1937 world simulation. And the people in that simulation who are being controlled are called avatars. So we have users and avatars. When a user takes over an avatar, it is 100% like he is living in 1937. And there's a surprise. Douglas Hall finds out that his world in 1995 is also a simulation, and so is he. That's the main surprise. There's a point where he just keeps driving straight until he finds the end of the simulation, where everything beyond that is not a visually rich reality, but just green wireframe. And that certainly called to mind for me Dark City. Do you have anything to add there?
It also harkens to the green screen,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So a great place to start, I think. I mean, the film opens with, I think, white text on black with the quote from Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." In the director's commentary, Joseph Rusnak says, "I think, therefore I am. Don't bet on it." But I have to basically agree with Descartes on this, except not so much as in terms of thinking, but in terms of witnessing one's thinking and experiencing. And I'm also of half a mind that that is more akin to what Descartes meant.
Well, if Descartes is aware of the fact that he's thinking, he's witnessing his thinking.
Mm-hmm. At least in terms of this quote, "I think, therefore I am," it seems more like it should be, "I am aware, therefore I am."
Right, well, it kind of opens up a question also about interior experience. If you're having some experience, if you have some kind of interior, doesn't that imply existence? Whether you're thinking or you're aware of the fact that you're thinking or whatever the cognitive endeavor happens to be.
Okay, right. Well, to me, the simplest interpretation of "I think, therefore I am," that it just means that I imagine an apple or something and that proves I exist, is, in light of Buddhist teachings, or even in light of someone like Ouspensky or Gurdjieff, it's incredibly suspect. I think Nietzsche basically destroyed that interpretation of that argument when he said that a thought comes when it wants to and not when I want. Thus, it is a falsification to say the subject is the condition for the predicate think. You know, like everyone knows those sleepless nights when thoughts keep coming when you don't want them to. And so it's almost like the thoughts have a kind of, I wouldn't say mind of their own, but they're animated, sort of self-animated. So in that sense of thinking, I wouldn't say at all that it proves the thinker's existence.
Okay, so what you're saying is something along the line of Gurdjieff's statement, "Life is only real when I am."
Right.
And of course, "I am" is a kind of connection that one makes when one becomes aware of one's existence.
Mm-hmm.
When one remembers oneself, to use fourth way parlance.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't it also true that you could look at existence, in a sense, on levels of gradation? And if some being is having some kind of experience, it's not necessarily the case that the thoughts that are arising consciously through directed thinking from the being, but the fact that there is a being experiencing the arising of those thoughts, wouldn't that being, however deficient in will they might be, wouldn't that being actually exist?
Right. Well, you're getting about an hour ahead of me there, but yeah, I agree totally with that, but I don't see how that follows from "I think, therefore I am."
Right. Well, I actually agree that I think, therefore I am. If one is making the statement, "I think, therefore I am," that statement arose in a reflective moment. That's what you're getting at.
Yeah, that's where I'm heading with Descartes' idea here. Yes. Let me just comment on that so that, I'm not still trying to lead up to it when we're already there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump the gun, but, I didn't know where you were going, and I felt like there's got to be some sort of ontological scale or something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give Descartes an interpretation where he means by thinking Gurdjieffian conscious mentation, or in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, Gurdjieff called it active being mentation. And that is thinking that is conscious, or thinking that comes from being, the two sides, knowledge and being. And Gurdjieff says that in the defaulty state we are in, that we depend instead on the automatic flows of thought. Those thoughts that just keep coming are almost like a life partner. Someone a little buddy who's always there to keep us occupied and entertained. but, they might just talk a little too much when we're trying to sleep. And Gurdjieff talks about trying to wake up the ability to mentate, but that our addiction to the flow of automatic associations keeps the ability asleep. And what I want to do is bring in here Descartes' idea of real speech. And real speech means utterances made concerning thought alone. So it involves a meta level of breaking out of a system or a recursion, because real speech is output from thoughts about thoughts.
Okay, so that's very clear.
Clear?
Yes.
Okay. And Descartes uses real speech as a test for whether a being has a mind.
You're reminding me of the systems theory definition of language as a linguistic reference to the linguistic domain.
Yeah. So we're talking about, a movie with a simulated reality, of course, and, real speech too can be faked. Like a person in the virtual reality of 1937 in the 13th Floor could be simply programmed to say, is the appearance of having thoughts the same as having thoughts? But with this real speech idea, to think about thoughts, as you said, implies consciousness, right?
Yes.
Right. It implies, there are certainly many moments where we're kind of wrapped up in our thoughts so that they are our whole world, but we can take a step back and realize that there are thoughts. We can realize our own thoughts and reflect on them. And that's kind of the recursive nature of consciousness. But so, yeah, that's my idea, is that when we look at I think, therefore I am through Descartes' concept of real speech, we could say that he is talking about something much more akin to Gurdjieff's active being mentation, which is a kind of awareness mixed in with the thinking, or a being mixed in with the thinking.
You're reminding me of a book by Heidegger that I read years ago called What is Called Thinking.
What is called thinking?
Yes, and I think he was getting at what you're getting at in terms of how you're interpreting Descartes. Similarly, in the introduction to Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard frames it as man being a relation. He describes him as a relation between the finite and the infinite. He names different kinds of extremes and polarities, and describes man as a kind of synthesis, which is essentially based on an awareness of the fact that he is a relation. So one doesn't have a self in that system unless you reflect upon the self. You relate to the fact that you're a relation.
Right, yeah. That seems to be basically what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's almost like you're there at some nexus in the chain of being, but until you relate to the fact that you are subsistent in that system of relations, you don't truly have a self.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think there's a Lacanian correlate, but I would have to go back and research that again, unless it's something that's readily available for you to talk about.
I feel like I know what you're groping towards, but I don't know exactly how to articulate it myself. But we're probably groping in the darkness towards the same thing.
Right. I think it's something about that cognizance of one's place in the symbolic order, something to do with that.
Well, yeah, it's something along the lines of that quote that Zizek loves. If a man thinks he's a king, even if he is a king, he's crazy, because he doesn't recognize that his role of being a king is essentially subsistent in that system of social relations.
Right. And
he's, in some sense, almost caught on flypaper or something.
Yeah, Jung talked about very similar ideas, kind of getting at that the accolades that society gives to you are really just a flabby identity. Like, that's not really who you are. And if you take yourself to be that, then you're not doing yourself any favors.
Well, it's something I actually think about a lot because for a couple of years now, I've been working as a teacher, and I see how hopelessly dependent on the opinions of others teenagers are. And it's so interesting because you can see them absorbed in a world where it's as if every one of them is in a movie and everyone is holding up that movie in their mind.
Yeah.
And after a couple of years, people don't really remember those students. There's people transferring in and out of the school. They've never even heard of that person.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's kind of one form of a simulated reality.
Very much so.
So while I'm a fan of the 13th Floor, I was kind of surprised with the shoddy way that the director dealt with Descartes' first meditation. When a person asserts, I am, there must be something doing that asserting. That thinking something must exist in order for the assertion to be made. And then when that person is asked who asserted that, the person who asserted it will say, it was I. So Descartes attaches our existence to this idea of a thinking thing, and he even tackles the possibility that this is a virtual world, like a piece of computer code, even though he was, many centuries before that. He's not saying I am so solidly as to say that the universe is real and that reality is real and so on. He's saying that even if all of this is a simulation, there is still something that must exist in order to assert I am. And if I am the one saying I am, then I am.
That's right. The whole process via which Descartes was led to that conclusion was a journey of profound skepticism.
Absolutely. He has the argument about the evil demon or the deceiving God who, he could simply fill every sense we have with things other than reality. Like, it could just be pumping this world that we're living in right now just into our brains at the moment so that this would only be a simulation. But, like, the key that we've been talking about is that conscious experience, even in a simulated world, cannot be faked. And I want to stress that point because I want to end the podcast talking about simulation theory. And the main thrust of the argument that I want to make against simulation theory has to do with consciousness. So, I kind of want to really drill in here. No matter how real or fake the world is that I experience, I still do experience it, and that cannot be denied. It's almost the flip side to active being mentation, where we are experiencing first, and the thoughts simply reflect that reality. So for someone living in a computer simulation, if that person is having conscious experiences, I would say that he or she must be something kind of above and beyond the simulation, in that if you are just a part of a program, you wouldn't be able to wake up from it. Because they're able to wake up from it, there would be a greater reality to that person.
Right, that's exactly what I was saying earlier. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, you can say, well, this person is not fully there because he hasn't, risen up to that level of consciousness. But if there's someone who wakes up, then there's somebody there to wake up.
Right. And what's cool to me is the 13th Floor deals with this. After we find out that the 1995 world is also a fake, Douglas meets that woman and they fall in love. And it turns out that she's from the year 2024. She's in another world. She's in the world that is simulating the 1995 world. She's a user diving into a 1995 avatar. And at the end of the movie, Douglas escapes with her help to the world that she lives in. And she tells him that even though he is a simulation, he has a soul, and that he is realer to her than anything else. So really, the film there is giving the same message, that there's a reality to him beyond the simulation, and that being an experiencing subject trumps the unreality of a simulation.
Right.
And then there's an Eastern thought corollary to this. A conscious being should have Buddha mind. If a person can consciously experience whatever fake or real world that he or she is in, then he or she can also reach enlightenment or absolute reality. To put it simply, right, our world is seen as samsara, as a kind of fake in Buddhism. So, at least a certain strains of Buddhism, we actually are already in a kind of simulation, but practices like meditation can allow us to apprehend absolute reality beyond the simulation. And I would say that that must be true for any conscious being in a simulation, or even in a simulation of a simulation of a simulation.
And as we have discussed in, for example, Microgeny Recapitulates Cosmology, the two truths really come into play here.
Yeah, absolutely.
A formulation that we discussed was, the world is illusory, only Brahman exists, Brahman is the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I guess relatively and absolutely. So I want to make what I think is a kind of cool move here, talking about the 13th Floor and Descartes. I think that leads directly to Blade Runner.
Okay.
First, the 13th Floor makes a lot of references to Blade Runner. Douglas Hall lives in, his apartment is the same apartment as Deckard's in Blade Runner. I think that's part of the Ennis house that Frank Lloyd Wright built. A major parallel in the 13th Floor, the bartender from 1937 escapes out of it to 1995 looking for answers, and he comes to Douglas Hall. So he's this white dyed blonde hair guy who's come looking for his maker, and that is obviously the android Roy Batty in Blade Runner, who goes to the Tyrell Corporation to meet and kill the man who made him.
You know, what's interesting about that, too? That actor plays the bartender in the Overlook Hotel.
Right, yeah.
And the footage from the beginning of The Shining is the same footage as the end of Blade Runner.
Right, yeah.
But that's a really good point. I really like that. So he's, in some sense, he's like Roy Batty.
Yeah, and I think I can bring up two meanings to the references that the 13th Floor makes. First, Zizek pointed out that Harrison Ford's character in Blade Runner, Rick Deckard, the name Rick Deckard is a play on René Descartes. Deckard and Descartes, with the first initial R in the first name. So both of those films are playing with these ideas of Descartes, how you define a thinking being, how you decide if something is real or not, and so on. And related to that is, the virtual worlds in the 13th Floor are filled with what you could call fake people, but their being conscious would mean that they're not actually fake. And in Blade Runner, the androids, the replicants, are fake humans in that they're robots that look like humans. But you actually start to see that they're more human than human, as the line in the movie goes. The humanity that Roy Batty shows toward Deckard, who is trying to kill him. The sheer liveliness of Roy Batty. Deckard's life is a bleak, emotionless thing for the most part, and it's actually the replicant who is really living life. That's the first idea that I had there.
Yeah, it reminds me of the scene where Deckard meets Tyrell and Rachel, and Tyrell comes out and says, "Is this to be an empathy test?"
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, the person who's being subjected to the empathy test is Deckard.
Right, that's actually the second idea I was going to bring up.
Really?
Yeah.
I think we're just kind of like tuning into the same frequency. Okay.
Yeah. My second idea was, that for both Douglas and Deckard, they're surrounded by people that they accept as simulations, but they never question whether they themselves might be too until, basically that's the surprise twist in both films.
Right.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about the holarchy before going to simulation theory?
Well, there was actually another point that I was interested in. I mean, you mentioned the connection to Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm.
And so Blade Runner is based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And that's actually an incredibly funny story.
Yeah.
And like much crazier and bizarre than Blade Runner. But also Philip K. Dick was obsessed with the idea of living in a simulation.
Yeah, absolutely. I brought up Philip K. Dick when we were recording the episode for Twin Peaks: The Return in terms of, his idea of pseudo-realities.
Right.
The simplest way to describe it is just consumer culture, where you kind of buy things to feel whole, instead of actually just becoming whole yourself. That's a kind of pseudo-reality. What you were describing with the teen students is a pseudo-reality.
Right. They're very much living in their ideas of what their reputations are.
Right.
So, would you like to give an introduction to the basic ideas of the holarchy?
Okay. I forgot which book this is, but Ken Wilber wrote, "Everywhere we look in nature, said the philosopher Jan Smuts, we see nothing but holes, and not just simple holes, but hierarchical ones. Each hole is a part of a larger whole, which is itself a part of a larger whole." So in nature, we find these things that are both a whole and a part, and Wilber calls them holons, and the hierarchy of holons is called the holarchy. You have the simple example of an atom being a whole thing in itself, but when atoms string themselves together to form molecules, an atom is then a part of some higher, more complex level of organization. So each level is a holon, with an atom as a subholon to the molecule as the superholon. And you get two senses of structure from the holarchy. It is hierarchical or vertical in that superholons are above or transcend subholons in terms of complexity, but it is also a nested structure in that superholons include within them subholons. And as with the atoms and molecules example, there is a physical reality holarchy, but there is also a mental reality holarchy, a developmental holarchy, and so on. It's basically a multi-level structuring of reality.
It's interesting, as you were just discussing, that if you look at integral theory, the integral stage is really the only stage to truly both transcend and include the previous stages.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I hadn't thought about that in relation to the holarchy.
Kind of makes me wonder how to relate those other stages to the holarchy.
Yeah, absolutely.
They always seem to be at war with the previous stages,
Yeah. It's almost like a miracle that we've gotten here.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about growth and development as the main sort of holarchy thing to then bring this back to the 13th floor.
Okay. Sounds fruitful.
Okay. The holarchy in relation to childhood development. These examples I'm just taking from my book. From the start, the fact that the levels to reality are holarchic implies an ethic, an order. It implies development or progression. Each move up a stage of development a person makes, this could be moral development, intellectual development, development of consciousness, etc., is a disidentification with the previous stage, which is a surrender or loss, and identification with the new one, which is a gain or transcendent shift. Wilber calls this differentiation and integration, or transcendence and inclusion. In his book, Integral Psychology, he uses the example of a young infant identified almost entirely with his body, then starting to identify with his mind, detaching from his body so that it becomes an object of him as subject. Wilber wrote, "Thus, the subject of one stage becomes an object of the next." With the break-off from an earlier stage, our memories of what it was like to be in that stage tend to disappear. An experiment has been performed along these lines. Young children sit with their teacher and an outside researcher. The researcher puts a box of chocolates in a desk drawer. The teacher then leaves the room. With the teacher absent, the researcher moves the chocolates to his briefcase. The researcher then asks the children where their teacher thinks the chocolates are. They answer in unison, in the briefcase. Because their knowledge is still undifferentiated from that of everyone else, meaning they do not have what is called theory of mind, they believe the teacher believes what they themselves believe. But just a year later, those same children will answer in the desk drawer, and they will completely disbelieve you, even if you have video evidence that they ever believed otherwise, especially something as stupid as the briefcase answer. We gained all kinds of masteries in childhood, like figuring out what our bodies can and can't do and learning our native language. And each progression keeps those past masteries such that your present level encapsulates them. So that's a nested hierarchy of progression. So that's basically a developmental holarchy.
Okay, well, that's very clear.
Okay, great. And then just to add one more thing about the holarchy, there are communications or interactions between superholons and subholons. Wilber gives the example that when you decide to move your arm, and you do so, all the atoms and molecules and cells in your arm move with it. So your mind, probably the most complex organizational level of yourself, decides to move an arm, and all of the levels of organization below that aid in making it happen. Now I want to relate that a little bit to the 13th floor, in that going from superholon down to subholon, there's a downward resonance in the 13th floor, in that the avatars, who are only supposed to experience amnesia when a user controls them, the avatars actually start to have dreams of the times that they were controlled. So that's what I'm calling a kind of downward resonance, which is interaction from superholon to subholon. And then there's the opposite. There's an upward resonance. An example of that is that Douglas starts smoking because his avatar in the 1937 simulation smokes. And another example would be that avatars have intuitive feelings that they have met someone before because their user met that person before.
Right. You get the impression that Douglas Hall actually had a kind of love at first sight experience. When he sees Fullard's daughter, it definitely feels like love at first sight.
Yeah, that's a great point. I forgot her name. I know Gretchen Mol played her, but...
Jane Fuller.
Jane Fuller, great.
Yeah.
So you have simulations within simulations within simulations, like 1937 up to 2024. So that's like the nested structure of the holarchy. You have levels. You could look at it like a ladder so that it's, the hierarchy of holons. You have these upward and downward resonances, which are like the subholon, superholon interactions. And then you have the name of the film, The 13th Floor, which implies levels. So I feel like there's a really solid interpretation to be had here with the 13th Floor and the holarchy.
I agree with you, but I have a slightly different interpretation, but I know that you actually have a criticism of the 13th Floor. So I want to hear that and then see if my different reading could help to frame it in a slightly different way.
That sounds cool.
Okay, good.
So, yeah, I wonder about why they chose the 13th floor. There's this superstition and buildings skip that floor and so on.
It's also the case that on the actual physical 13th floor, they have a lot of the different machines, the different aspects of technicality that run the building.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And one other thing I would bring up is that when you see Douglas Hall's office, the machine that lets you go to the simulated reality is on the 13th floor of the building, but outside shots show that the building is a skyscraper. So the 13th floor isn't the top floor. In other words, 1995 is not the real reality. It's the top of everything. It's just another simulation among the other simulations.
Right.
So, yeah, my criticism here, by looking at the 13th floor in terms of the holarchy, the one real major issue with the interpretation is that the trick to ascending in the movie is to be an avatar whose user dies while using the avatar. I think that's how it works. The bartender in 1937 was being controlled by the sort of white-haired programmer in Douglas Hall's company, and the programmer died in the 1937 world, and the bartender's consciousness entered the programmer's. So then the bartender existed in the 1995 world, right? He was able to ascend through that death. You could set things in motion to purposely kill a user and send the avatar up, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? So we're talking about, growth and development, but the mechanism in the movie means that you can ascend by killing people.
Maybe it's a critique of this brutal world that we've created. I think that's a really solid criticism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple things I'd like to say about that.
Okay.
Well, I think it's interesting if you look at the simulation within the simulation. The simulation that's being run in the 90s is a simulation of the 30s. And the simulation that's being run in whatever it is, 2024, is a simulation of the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that there's a simulation of the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one way of possibly reading things metaphorically is that if someone dies in the past and then they appear in the future, it's almost as if they were reincarnated. Now, I know that doesn't really work in a one-to-one way because, someone just kind of awakens into that other world as an adult and doesn't go through an entire life. But what part of it is not just that people have experiences and they develop in these different worlds. Mm-hmm. Within each individual world, a particular person's level of development doesn't seem higher or lower based on where they are in this holarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I think that's true.
You think that's true? So one of the things we talked about in the discussion of holarchy in Twin Peaks: The Return is this idea of communion and agency,
mm-hmm.
and how communion and agency are characteristics of holons, but that actually has to do with a horizontal plane, and that there's a kind of sweet spot, which is a perfect balance where you have communion in agency, communion with agency, and then agency in communion. And that actually facilitates transcendence that allows you to get to the next level wherein greater possibilities for agency and communion exist. And you're saying the idea that engineering the death of your user is, I think, is pretty distinct from that, obviously. But if you take the holarchy, this nested system, and turn it so that it's lying horizontally, and you simply think of it not as a true holarchy, but as a simulation of a holarchy, it actually kind of makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Because at the end of the movie, that final beautiful image when they're in that world and together in 2024, the image kind of shrinks down, contracting down to a point like someone just pulled the plug on it, and that is just a simulation.
Yeah, it's a replication of the effect of a CRT monitor being turned off.
Exactly. So I think the idea is that the whole thing, that there isn't actually a kind of master level that you could get if you could get to the top floor of the building, if you will, and say, this is the kind of master reality that's generating all these simulations. It's more as if it's all simulation.
Well, that's very Baudrillard.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to get to Baudrillard, and that there's something beyond this kind of moving, and I really do think it's interesting that it's framed as going deeper into simulations, you're going further into the past.
Mm.
And that theoretically, if you got to the next level that was simulating the 2024, that would be further into the future.
Right. Okay, well, I just have two short ideas before I want to go on to simulation theory. I don't know if you noticed, but Douglas Hall's avatar is named John Ferguson.
Yeah, although I think it was actually after you mentioned it to me before.
Okay. Right. Well, John Scotty Ferguson is the main character in Vertigo, right?
Right.
So we're kind of linking avatars and doppelgangers there. And Douglas's girlfriend explains that he's a copy of her husband, but missing the abusiveness that started recently. So Jane Fuller is seeing Douglas Hall as an idealized version of another man, and she is making him into a virtual copy of him psychologically. And so obviously I think there's a resonance with Vertigo there. And it also adds to the idea that simulations, well, like a lot of science fiction dreams are basically the desire to build a Freudian wish fulfillment device. And, well, there's another similar resonance with Vertigo, right? That when Jane disappears, Douglas re-finds her, and she's just a cash register girl in some random store. Like different women who are all the same person.
Yes, that is very similar to when he encounters Judy Barton.
Right?
As Judy Barton rather than Madeline.
Yeah. And then, so the last thing I was going to bring up was just, that if we take it that it's not just all simulation and that the 13th floor is showing a possibility of ascendance, then it's actually a little bit more of a complex movie of this type. In my book, I compared it to the first Matrix movie and Mind Warp are both more kind of black and white. The real reality and the virtual reality are truly distinct. The virtual reality serves an enslaving function, and the temptations of the virtual reality make it out basically that if we choose to remain enslaved, then the virtual reality will make all our dreams come true, and that's like Cypher in the Matrix, right? There's no verticality. There's only an opposition between a bland, boring, real reality and a fake reality that offers all the excitement you can imagine. So I think you could do an interpretation where the 13th floor is more like the two truths, like Nagarjuna's view of nirvana and samsara.
Okay, so there's a couple points I'd like to make. If you take it that all the worlds are actually simulations and that a person could be moving from world to world to world, then couldn't that be the experience of the world is an illusion, and then the deeper reality they realize is actually the source that's creating the simulation across the board, across the spectrum, and then coming back to realize the relative reality of every simulation.
Yeah, absolutely. You can read it that way. It's kind of almost like thinking that you're getting out of samsara by changing the channels on the TV.
Right. I also think that, it's kind of you're connecting it to Vertigo. Vertigo, in a certain sense, it really deals with being possessed by the past. Where you get into I think her name was Carlotta Valdez, or whoever the original woman was in Vertigo. And a kind of pattern that repeats itself, and a kind of process of imitation, and a way in which by playing out the story, you kind of become possessed by the story.
Yeah.
I definitely want to get more into that when we discuss Twin Peaks. But I think that there's this idea that you see in other works, including The Shining, of trying to transcend some sort of pattern of action, which is tragic. And I've been listening to the Cardigan song that plays at the end of the 13th floor, and it's called Erase and Rewind. And that seems to be what people were trying to use the simulations for, and how it makes a lot of sense that a simulation within a simulation would go deeper into the past. So, for example, the character Fuller was going into, actually, what was his name in the original?
He's Hannon Fuller in the 1995 world, isn't he?
And yeah, so he's Hannon Fuller, but he's also her father. He's Jane Fuller's, okay, well, she's just playing the role of Jane Fuller. But he also appears as what you get the impression that he's actually her father in the 2024 world.
Mm-hmm.
You see him out on the beach. But yeah, so he's Hannon Fuller. And he goes and he uses Grierson as an avatar in 1937. And what was he doing in that world?
Mm-hmm.
He was having sex with virtual women. So he was going back to the past to, maybe he had a sense of having missed out. So he essentially went back to the past for sex.
Mm-hmm.
Why does she go back as Jane Fuller? She goes back, like the song says, erase and rewind. She wants to go back to find the man that she originally fell in love with.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see David, who's the, her husband in the future world who's become criminally insane, when he says, because I like it, when she talks about him having become a murderer, the way he moves his hands like he's one of the dancers from the 1937 world. And it just reminds me of how everything is pervading everything else, like you're talking about the resonances.
Mm-hmm.
And you get the sense that when you talk about the holarchy, that he had basically become like a Wyndham Earle character.
Yeah.
He was seeking agency. Where does the violence in the 13th Floor come from? It comes from people seeking agency.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Jerry Ashton, who's the avatar of Jason Whitney, whom you're comparing to Roy Batty, Roy Batty goes to the head of the Tyrell Corporation. He is asking Tyrell to give him more life, right? Because they had programmed in a 4-year lifespan for the replicants.
Mm-hmm.
But you see Ashton talking more about being a god.
Yeah.
And that's how he talks to Douglas, like, oh, you're a god. So he came up out of that world looking to be a god, and David, in a sense, is trying to be a god.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of loss of balance is something that we can interpret a person as a villain. And it's true that the person actually is a villain, but it's not that difficult for something like that to happen to a person when they have the realization that they're living in a simulation.
Mm-hmm.
Or like when they see what the potential is.
Right.
And so I, in some sense, see when you're talking about the wish fulfillment is exactly that, like a person seeing something having gone so wrong, but imagining that things could have been different and wanting to have that relationship. So Douglas Hall really is David before going insane. And it's an insanity that exists in a search for greater agency. And if you look at what's happening between Jane Fuller and Douglas Hall, I would call that communion.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about holons finding a balance between agency and communion, it's possible they might actually find that balance. And when we reflect upon our own past, I'm sure that almost everybody must have fantasies about going back into the past and behaving differently in some situation, particularly in a romantic context.
Yeah. A lot of them are sitting in prisons.
This is true. This is very true. And yeah, it's often a destructive path, but if you think about the novel The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, in that novel, he goes back and then everything plays out exactly as it did before. And in fact, he even eventually forgets that he went back and just finds himself caught in exactly the same trajectory, just in the flow of that river.
Right. I had just told you a few days ago about watching the reincarnation of Golden Lotus, which is almost, a Hong Kong film that almost repeats Ouspensky's novel, where the woman ends up creating a kind of love triangle situation by marrying someone that, isn't really all that, but his brother is more attractive. And, then as she's building that triangle, she starts having flashbacks, and it turns out that in her past reincarnation, she did exactly the same thing. And then, of course, that reincarnation was, probably just doing the same thing of the previous reincarnation and so on.
Exactly. And that maps really nicely to this reading that points out the chronology of the worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, though, in The Strange Life of Ivana Sokin, when he comes back to consciousness in the present, he realizes that in the present he can actually act and he can do things differently, and it might not be too late to have a relationship with this woman.
Yeah.
And there's something in this journey through these different worlds that allows for that possibility. And if so, if they're actually finding the balance of agency and communion, almost like they found each other across time, then I find that to be a very romantic film.
Yeah, well, I like that interpretation. And we talked about, by being conscious experiencing beings, they somehow rise above the idea that they're in a simulation. And so these are real people traveling fake worlds to find real love.
Right. And it's possible that the true transcendence to the next level of the holarchy will take place through the realization of Douglas Hall and Jane Fuller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets into the real fake relationship, which, as a companion episode to this one, I want to do an analysis of Satoshi Kon's Paprika, and the real fake relation will come up quite a bit in that episode.
Oh, yeah. I was feeling intimations of that when I was talking about Vertigo. Yeah, we're going to have a deeper conversation about Vertigo, but that's going to happen in Twin Peaks: The Return. So would you like to actually discuss the simulation hypothesis?
Yeah, the simulation within a simulation idea in the 13th Floor really makes me want to get into that. But just before that, I want to bring up this really cool manga by Satoshi Kon called Opus. It's about a manga creator, and one of the characters I forgot if it was a man or a woman. I'll just say it's a woman. One of the characters in her manga escapes through a hole into the manga creator's world, and then she wonders if that reality might also be something written by someone else, if her world is being written by someone. And then, of course, in the ending, which was unpublished, the manga creator pops her head out of a hole and peers into Satoshi Kon's room. So then, of course, we should question if our reality is being written by someone. So, there you really have 13th Floor, simulation theory. The manga within the manga is called Resonance, which gets at the reverberations between levels of reality or between holons and all of that.
Another way of describing that is saying there's always a larger context.
Yeah, definitely. Kon played a good trick on people. When you open the manga to the first page, the manga is called Opus, but when you open it to the first page is the cover for a manga called Resonance, and you feel like maybe they misprinted it, or, you somehow bought the wrong book or something. Those tricks that he plays, I also feel are his cinematic method of making us kind of snap out of it and realize a larger framework.
That is very interesting. So it's a manga inside of a manga.
Yeah.
That's a nice little technique.
Right? I mean, anything that can kind of take us out of, what you called our sort of color by numbers way of doing things, Anything that can get us past our go-to moves is going to awaken something larger within us.
And of course, some people would be familiar with this idea of nested worlds from the film Inception.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then we're going to be doing a companion podcast to this on Paprika, which was an influence for Inception, or I guess the influence.
Right.
So you hit on, especially if it is all simulation, then there would really be no difference between the levels, like between Douglas Hall's level and Jane Fuller's level. But if there is an actual sort of top a real world at the top of that great chain of simulation, in the 13th floor at least, you'd be able to tell whether you're at the top level of reality or not in a number of ways, one of which would be to check whether you are having amnesia or not. I doubt that in a real simulation that there would be such telltale signs, checking whether you have amnesia or not. But I also like this question of whether you could move up levels, like in the 13th floor, not in terms of like a holarchy metaphor or whatever, but just actually, in terms of the computers. Programming right now is very imperfect, and I don't think humans could actually make it perfect. Maybe an AI could, but if programming isn't made perfect, then we already know the hacking techniques to move upward, like escalating privilege to the hypervisor. So if we could get a line, like they used the payphones in the Matrix for, we could hack ourselves up to the top level of the simulation. So in that way as well, the levels could be all the same, sort of ontologically speaking. But if the programming were made perfect by an AI or something like that, that could actually block that kind of ascendance. And actually that scenario is used in the movie Nirvana from 1997, but I guess maybe that would be for another podcast.
Well, I plan on watching Nirvana within the next week, so yeah, I think we could end up doing one. I'm in love with the soundtrack so far.
Ah, yeah, cool.
But looking at this idea, you're talking about amnesia, and maybe you don't have such obvious telltale signs.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Inception, they would have a spinning top, and it would just keep spinning if it happened to be a simulation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not a simulation, in that case, a dream, which is a kind of psychological simulation.
Right.
But what you're saying makes a lot of sense. The other part of it with the future, though, is it's interesting if you go in general with the idea of reaching a point in the future where you can actually simulate the past. In the 13th floor, they thought they had reached that point, but that actually was a simulation from their future.
Right.
But you're saying you think you could trump that with a hacking method where you would have certitude that you'd reached the final world?
Well, the world before the final world, right? I mean, if we're just zeros and ones, we're not going to make it out into the flesh world. the world of meat that made the simulation. But if the programming remains imperfect, then we would be able to go to that level.
I think a lot of people may have missed that Twin Peaks reference.
Well, I think that we should also state Bostrom's argument. I mean, it's actually kind of secondary because I'm not going to pick at it, but I grabbed this online, so I'm only kind of hoping it's accurate. At least one of three possibilities is true. 1. All human-like civilizations in the universe go extinct before they develop the technological capacity to create simulated realities. 2. If any civilizations do reach this phase of technological maturity, none of them will bother to run simulations. Or 3. Advanced civilizations would have the ability to create many, many simulations, and that means there are far more simulated worlds than non-simulated ones. And then from that, Bostrom argues that the third one is the most likely. So statistically speaking, that would mean the odds are very, very heavily in favor of our world being a simulation rather than the top level reality that is creating the simulations. I don't really have any problems with the argument as explicitly stated. I mean, we're creating simulations all the time now, and we will create more and more. And if that does continue, if we don't get wiped out, then yeah, the number of simulated worlds will outnumber the number of non-simulated ones. And so statistically, the odds would be that we are living in a simulation.
That sounds like a pretty good summary. Just for the sake of listeners, I'd like to maybe try to work out a little bit of the details with what you were talking about with hacking your way to the hypervisor. Mm-hmm. So the hypervisor itself would be a virtual machine within the supercomputer that would be running the simulation?
Yeah, I mean, basically it's, well, you can create and run virtual machines, and then the creation of a virtual machine kind of separates what you're doing inside that virtual machine from what's going on in the actual machine. So if you're going to hack your way to the hypervisor, that means basically that you're going to hack your way out of the virtual machine into the machine that's running the virtual machine. And I mean, depending on how things go, I mean, this is all kind of hypothetical, but there could be nested virtual machines within an actual machine running multiple levels of simulations or whatever. But all that I mean is, when we talked with James Forshaw about this, we talked about the example of the PlayStation 3. They were going to allow the PlayStation 3 to run Linux, and, that was part of their advertising campaign, because the PlayStation 3 running Linux was a powerful system for running simulations for research. But Sony was very scared that allowing the machine to run Linux would allow hackers to go through Linux and sort of tunnel out of Linux into the actual machine, and then, figure out how to get pirated games and such to run on it. So the hypervisor is this virtual machine that isolates Linux from the actual computer, the actual PlayStation 3 system. And so that's what I'm talking about, is breaking out of that virtualization.
Right, you could almost think about the hypervisor as the kind of the overarching, the top of the pyramid or something.
Yeah, something like that. In the metaphor of the 13th floor, once you broke out of the 1937 hypervisor, then you would have to break out of the 1995 hypervisor and so on, all the way to the top.
Right. You can have virtual machine monitors that are themselves virtual machines being monitored by other virtual machine monitors?
You could. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the way it would go. Is one person running nested simulations? I know it's a kind of fun, jokey thing to do, with computer emulators, where you can emulate a certain computer on your computer, and then within that emulated computer, you can emulate another computer and so on. It's just a kind of laugh, but or is it that, okay, you've got the 1995 world, and then, yeah, that's simulating the 1937 world.
I just want to know, is there really a way for us to say, this is it? We made it. It's there's that scene in, I think it's the second, or I think it's the third Matrix movie. It's, where Neo, he's supposedly out of the Matrix, but he is able to stop some sentinels just with a gesture of his hand.
Right.
And that leads some people to think that, wait a minute, is that a Matrix that contains the Matrix that we know as the Matrix?
Right.
Is this another nested situation?
Right. Well, I mean, I think as long as you keep doing your hacking, you're not going to get 100% certitude, but as long as the techniques keep working, you should be able to find yourself, find your way to the top. And yeah, you brought up Inception with the spinning top. Then there's the 13th floor with the amnesia. In the Matrix, you have the glitches in the Matrix. And the glitches in the Matrix also show that the programming is not perfect. So yeah, if it were a world like the Matrix, then you would certainly be able to get to the top level. Well, for Bostrom's argument, there are some implicit assumptions in it that you can argue against. And I want to do that with one of the assumptions. And that assumption is that simulated worlds will be populated with conscious beings. And it's not obvious at all to me that simulated worlds could be populated with conscious beings. Can conscious minds be put on silicon? I mean, that's the situation in the 13th floor, right? So that's why I wanted to get into the simulation hypothesis here. Yeah, I know I've talked to you before about it would be a kind of neat gimmick for a short science fiction story. We all know that the science fiction trope of uploading ourselves onto computers, but let's just say that we have souls, and then if that's the case, one fear would be that uploading ourselves into the machine would untether us from our souls. Like the soul needs us to be in meat as it were. And how many people...
You keep making reference to that, and people who are listening, they don't know that you and I actually sat and read that dialogue together.
Yeah. They're Made of Meat. I would recommend everyone to read that.
So you can find They're Made of Meat online, and preferably you should read it with a friend.
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, and these days, like a lot of people argue, why would that have to be? Like, why would the soul need us to be in meat? Why would meat be the only substrate for consciousness? And I'd kind of like to argue against that, or give a kind of answer to that while attacking the implicit assumption in Bostrom's simulation hypothesis about the possibility of simulated worlds being populated with conscious beings. And so my first argument for that is fairly long. So I guess before that, I'd ask if you have anything you want to say.
Well, there's a kind of duality to what you're describing, which reminds me of Descartes again.
Mm-hmm.
The whole issue of how the soul is connected to the body, and I guess for him it was through the pineal gland.
Right. And people have had a lot of fun with that when, I guess, they found DMT in the pineal gland of mice. I think also humans now.
Believe it or not, a number of my students have brought this up to me. It's interesting that when you have these different worlds, there is an idea that there has to be some kind of a nexus, some kind of way that a connection is made.
Mm.
And you're suggesting that connection can be lost.
Yeah. We would be able to tell if when we uploaded ourselves into the machine, like, if we were missing a finger or something, it would just be like, oh, actually only 99% got uploaded. But what if things like the future developmental stages that people like Wilber have worked out, what if those are the missing pieces? We wouldn't even know it, and we would be stunted for eternity.
Yeah, there's something about living forever as an attenuated copy of yourself that isn't very appealing, especially if the capacity that's been removed is the capacity for further development.
Exactly, and you don't know that it's not there. And so then you probably wouldn't really know about development, or even more a hellish experience would be that you know that there is development, but you just can't do it.
Right.
So let me give my first argument about this whole consciousness thing. And it's going to be a little long running, but, feel free to interject, and I'll let you know when this first argument has completed, okay?
Okay.
Originally, this is Jaron Lanier's argument. He was the first person to create virtual reality. He was the inventor of virtual reality, I guess you could say. Really interesting thinker. Probably my favorite thinker on technology. Anyway, I'm going to use his argument. He was using it kind of against people like Daniel Dennett, but I'm just going to use it here and point it at this consciousness assumption of the simulation hypothesis. Unfortunately, the essay in which Jaron's argument disappeared from the internet, but he made a new version. It's really changed, so I'll kind of paraphrase the first version from memory and quote a little bit from the new version. It proceeds into further and further absurdity and you can't really rationally pick a point at which the thought experiment has gone too far. Anyway, we start what I'm going to call the substrate argument. We create an electronic device or a nanomachine or whatever that can perfectly emulate a single neuron. And we replace one of your neurons with it. You feel fine, so then we replace every neuron with one of those nanomachine emulators. All's okay. Then we create a software version of the neuron emulator, and we run your brain in software. We're just very careful to make sure that all the neurons in the emulator on the computer are connected the very same way your neurons are in your brain, and so on. In which case, the activity of the emulated neurons could simply be represented by a list of numbers. Whatever data is required, like whether it's firing or not, or how strongly it's firing, its position, what other neurons it's connected to, it could all just be represented by a list of numbers. If we record the state of all the neurons in the emulator when you're happy, then we could load that state back into the emulator by giving it the list of numbers generated when you were happy, and it would emulate your brain being happy for some near instantaneous slice of time. So the state of the emulator at any point can be stored as a very long number, and the state of the emulator over time can be stored as a very long series of very long numbers. So we can start feeding program data from wherever. And let me quote Jaron's newer essay here. So let's build a truly unusual sort of computer. We first record a bunch of data from the natural world, such as the trajectories in a meteor shower. We then rely on massive quantities of computation and luck to construct just the right computer that happens to read the meteor shower as a program, such that it happens to be equivalent to your brain. In other words, when a natural phenomenon like a meteor shower is measured, it turns into a string of numbers. The program that runs a computer, the object code, is also a string of numbers, so we have two similar items. If you can find the matching computer, any particular string of numbers can run as a program. In fact, for any string of numbers, you can in theory find or construct many computers, each of which will run the same string of numbers as a different program. So one computer might read the meteor shower and end up doing your taxes as a result, while another might calculate racetrack odds from exactly the same object code. If your brain is functionally equivalent to a computer program, there is no reason a meteor shower can't be that program if you take the trouble to find the right computer to run it. Does even the possibility of this computer give the meteor shower consciousness, if only for a moment? And that's the end of the quote. So the next question really for me is the meteor shower implementing another instance of you for that moment? The neurons in your brain are in a series of states over time. Those states become large numbers. The trajectories of rocks in the meteor shower become the same large number. What's the difference? And there are infinite possible computers and infinite natural phenomena to give to those computers. So there would have to be many, many implementations of other instances of you happening right now all across the universe. James Forshaw mentioned to me that, of course, in pi, if pi is indeed infinitely non-repeating, then every brain state throughout your life could be found in that precise order in pi. So a computer fed that portion of pi would repeat your life. Is that an implementation of another instance of you? If so, there would be millions or billions or trillions of implementations of you throughout the universe. Can we accept that? To me, the more obvious idea seems to be that the situation is situated in you, that you alone are the experiencer of your experiences, that you alone, in your situation as an embodied creature, right, experience as you experience. So, to me, Jaron's argument really problematizes the idea of uploading our consciousness into the computer.
That's very interesting. And I think that a big part of the thrust of what you're getting at, I think, pertains to Wilber's quadrants. Because the idea of finding a way to model the function of the brain is something which takes place in the what we would call the objective singular. So it's being treated as an object, but the actual experience of being that being is not actually accessible through the objective quadrant. It is its own quadrant.
Yeah, that's a good connection to make.
It reminds me a little bit of the teleporter in Star Trek also. If you can be beamed here and there and then be reconstituted, what about making copies?
Yeah.
And what would be the ontological status of those copies?
Right.
I also look at it from the perspective that if you have a code and then you have some method, some kind of prism for breaking things down and decoding something, how do you know how many levels of code are actually there?
Are you talking about the brain or...
Yeah, in some sense. I feel like there's inevitably a process of interpretation that's taking place when you're modeling something.
Yeah.
And I feel that you could have something analogous, like you have some kind of puzzle and there's a right answer to the puzzle. And that in some sense, you actually just captured the essence of the puzzle, if you will. But what if there's actually another level of the puzzle that you don't see? And because you don't see it, you're not actually able to capture it. Because if you take that essence that you think you have extracted and then remodel it, that higher level of what's being encoded is lost because you've changed some aspect of the form because that aspect of the form was not relevant to you.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it kind of goes with my idea of that, if we were to upload ourselves into the computer, that we might untether ourselves from the soul or from our potential, because that's just something that we can't see, that we didn't include in our interpretation when we set about making the model.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same thing from a different perspective. Yeah. Right.
And then, we're getting really close to things like steganographic file systems. The creator of a simulation could hide away stuff in such a file system. The main point here with, steganography, right, is that you can have a computer and you open the hard drive and you look at the files and you're like, okay, there's the files, that's fine. But actually, if you used a different password to log into the computer, then you would be given deeper access to the hard drive and you would find many more files there.
Yeah, that's exactly, what I was groping towards. Yeah.
So I have a few shorter arguments on the consciousness point as well that I figured I'd make. I think they're good arguments, and Neil, I don't think that there's actually been that much argument. I think most people were kind of very happy to accept Bostrom's argument, they kind of feel it would be exciting if we were living in a simulation or something like that. I haven't seen that many arguments against his argument.
Well, I think actually one of the attractions to the idea of living in a simulation is that then death is also simulated.
Yeah.
So it hints at the possibility of immortality.
Yeah, absolutely. So many people, including some interesting physicists, have hypothesized that consciousness is at the root level of reality, or that it is the root level of reality. And so then, in order to have conscious beings in your simulation, you would actually need to fully simulate every aspect and detail of the universe from top to bottom. Let's say that future computers, far, far distant future computers, are just so ridiculously fast that they can pull off simulating every aspect of the universe. One possibility, though, is that they could do it, but they wouldn't be able to do it in real time. And in a sense, that would be fine because each slice of time or frame generated would give us the feeling of existing for that frame, and then there would just be a kind of dead space where we would not exist between those frames. Okay, so let's just go ahead and say that they have enough fast silicon or whatever other type of computing they're using, and they are able to do the universe in real time. But there is the Goldilocks principle, right? Where somehow the universe became just right so that conscious life was possible, that our planet needed to be just the right distance from the sun and all of that. So one question is, what if in order to get the full simulation of our universe just right, we need to start simulating at the Big Bang? Of course, we could talk about simulating from before the Big Bang, whatever that means. I don't know what it means. Is it even possible or whatever? But if we have to start simulating from the Big Bang, then how fast would the computer have to be to run through 14 billion years to get the simulation running 2021? I mean, that's something to think about with this. At what point of resolution would consciousness hypothetically emerge? I definitely don't think it's the resolution of today's physics models. The joke about, like, when you want to start modeling complex physical behavior, you start by assuming a spherical cow. And, and it's certainly not the resolution of the economics models we have, where people will or won't buy something for, 1,000 reasons, but then you just pick 2 reasons and model and predict based on those 2. It's nowhere near reality. And
You're reminding me of E.F. Schumacher's criticism of economists, where he said it's a combination of huge assumptions and subtle calculations.
Yeah, or Freeman Dyson on economics. What did he say? Their predictions are shit. So this is like all kind of interlinked. There's just like one more piece to get through here. At what resolution would consciousness hypothetically appear? One thing I noticed in the 13th Floor, I'm not an expert on the way different dollar bills looked throughout the century, but I believe that modern money was being passed in the 1937 world. And that could have just been a mistake, a goof or whatever. But it could also you could interpret it that maybe you can just get away with something slightly imperfect. I don't know. So the last point for this argument is X-rays weren't discovered until 1895. And then we found atoms, and the whole thing went until like a few years back. We found tetraquarks and all of that. But how much more is going to be found in, say, the next 3,000 years? So what I want to argue is that as the scientific instruments advance and we discover that there is more and more to the universe, just how much more would there be that needs to be simulated? For computer power, in the 13th Floor, there's a kind of Moore's Law joke. The years of the simulation, like going from 1937 to 1995 is 58 years, but then going from 1995 to 2024 is only 29 years, so half the number of years. So it's just a kind of nod to Moore's Law. But if Moore's Law holds, then computer technological growth is exponential. But then we would have to graph that against the growth and the depth of understanding of the universe that we get with the new scientific instruments that come along. How much more computer power would be needed to simulate, the trillions or whatever instances of the 59 new hadrons discovered in the Large Hadron Collider. I think there are actually a lot of technological questions about whether it would even be possible to simulate our universe. And even if it were so, would that universe be populated by conscious beings? And I really feel like the substrate argument I made based on Jaron Lanier's argument does a good job of arguing against that.
Right. I see what you're saying. I mean, you're essentially saying if it is, in fact, grounded in some kind of consciousness, then if your simulation lacks the integrity to ground that consciousness, you really don't have the cytoplasm to hold the cell together.
Right.
It's kind of like this idea of saying, oh, well, we only need to simulate his heart when you're doing open heart surgery or something. It's like, not if you want him to actually be an authentic embodied being. He's got to have a heart beating.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, and then, okay, maybe if you could, hypothetically make him a whole, embodied being, then, I have the other argument that maybe the simulation has to start from the Big Bang, in which case, I mean, given, what we know about computing power, like to simulate every hadron, every quark, every atom in the universe for 14 billion years, that's going to take some time, maybe more time than the universe has. I wanted to bring up a few kind of ideas there that work against that implicit assumption, because maybe I'm an old diehard in some kind of way, but it just doesn't seem possible to me. And I mean, what Jaron Lanier was talking about is basically that, for like people like Dennett, they don't feel like anything really special is going on here. And so there's like, yeah, obviously you could just upload yourself, but it's not obvious to me or to Jaron on that point.
Well, okay, so in a very general sense, the premise of the objections seems to be a general objection to reductionism. Yeah,
definitely.
And just to put this in a certain context, you could look at something like the Quine-Duhem theory on underdetermination of theories, where we don't get scientific theories directly from nature. Scientific theories exist within the framework of other scientific theories.
Right.
So, for example, if we have a scientific theory and we make a prediction and we use an electron microscope to test whether that comes to fruition, then our theory is now intimately connected with the theory of the electron microscope. I mean, what you're really talking about in terms of those who seem so easily sold on the idea of being able to upload our consciousness into some kind of computer does feel a little bit like intellectual arrogance.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, there are other impetuses, like Ray Kurzweil has been, one of the biggest proponents of, being able to upload ourselves. And it seems to stem from, he had a loved one that died, and he's kind of emotionally reacting that with these technological fantasies of immortality.
Right. There's a feedback system, like when you talk about cryogenics and Walt Disney and all this stuff. So there's the desire for immortality, and there's the desire for people who are promising it. It's their desire for money. There's an interplay here.
Yeah. So I know you wanted to bring in Baudrillard. Do you want to get into that?
Sure. Okay, so I want to read a passage from Baudrillard, and this is from Simulations.
Uh-huh.
He's talking
about...
The
Matrix book.
Yes. He's talking about iconoclasts, and let me see where to start this.
In the meanwhile, I do have to say, I like when this book from Baudrillard appears on screen in The Matrix. It's like, I think it's the book that Keanu Reeves' character hides the drugs in.
Their rage to destroy images rose precisely because they sensed this omnipotence of simulacra, this facility they have of effacing God from the consciousness of men, and the overwhelming destructive truth which they suggest, that ultimately there has never been any God, and that only the simulacrum exists, indeed that God himself has only ever been his own simulacrum. Had they been able to believe that images only occulted or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reason to destroy them. One can live with the idea of a distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the images concealed nothing at all, and that in fact they were not images, such as the original model would have made them, but actually perfect simulacra, forever radiant with their own fascination. But this death of the divine referentiable has to be exercised at all cost. it can be seen that the iconoclasts, who are often accused of despising and denying images, were in fact the ones who accorded them their actual worth, unlike the iconolators, who saw in them only reflections and were content to venerate God at one remove. But the converse can also be said, namely that the iconolators were the most modern and adventurous minds, since underneath the idea of the apparition of God in the mirror of images, they already enacted his death and his disappearance in the epiphany of his representations, which they perhaps knew no longer represented anything, and that they were purely a game, but that this was precisely the greatest game, knowing also that it is dangerous to unmask images, since they dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them.
Well, the first thing I think of is that it's kind of like the pseudo-realities that Philip K. Dick was writing about. It's like those writings were a reflection of like actual nightmares of pseudo-realities that he would have at night. But those nightmares were actually just so extremely potent that it was difficult to get them down on paper with, that kind of nightmarish quality.
Right. He, in some sense, was experiencing something like it was like a real life experience of René Descartes' meditations.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read a little bit further.
Okay.
This was the approach of the Jesuits, who based their politics on the virtual disappearance of God and on the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciences, the evanescence of God in the epiphany of power, the end of transcendence, which no longer serves as alibi for a strategy completely free of influences and signs. Behind the baroque of images hides the gray eminence of politics. Thus, perhaps at stake has always been the murderous capacity of images, murderers of the real, the murderers of their own model as the Byzantine icons could murder the divine identity. To this murderous capacity is opposed the dialectical capacity of representations as a visible and intelligible mediation of the real. All of Western faith and good faith was engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could exchange for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. God, of course. But what if God himself can be simulated, that is to say, reduced to the signs which attest to his existence? Then the whole system becomes weightless. It is no longer anything but a gigantic simulacrum, not unreal, but a simulacrum, never again exchanging for what is real, but exchanging in itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. This would be the successive phases of the image. It is the reflection of a basic reality. It masks and perverts a basic reality. It masks the absence of a basic reality. It bears no relation to any reality whatever. It is its own pure simulacrum. I think there's quite a bit that you can mine from that.
Yeah, definitely.
In a certain respect, I realized as I was looking over this passage, this is exploring the implications of post-structuralism.
Mm-hmm. Listening to it, I'm empathizing with the dizziness of Errol Morris. There were two waves of a school of German philosophy that kind of gave birth to critical theory.
Right, well, there's the Frankfurt School and then the second generation Frankfurt School.
Yeah, it was Adorno and Horkheimer.
Sure, yeah.
The way that they saw the world heading was one in which people sit down in a restaurant to eat and they're given the menu and then they're supposed to eat the menu.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that seemed to be something similar to some of the things that Baudrillard passage was getting at.
Well, I think one of the really central ideas is that the guarantor is God.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a strange process, if you look at it, where he talks about the phases. It is the reflection of a basic reality. It masks and perverts a basic reality. It masks the absence of a basic reality. It bears no relation to any reality whatever. So, what happened? Wasn't it supposed to be based on something in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even what we're talking about with simulation, the idea of the simulation is that there really was something, and then some civilization reached some level of advancement that they were able to simulate it.
Well, to try to take a stab on it, based on what we've been talking about, the simulation is a kind of copy of the reality, but maybe it's imperfect in some way. But it does cover up the fact, it covers up the real reality so that, like, when we're in the simulation, we believe in the simulation. But then, like we had both been saying, by trying to model the universe, you're introducing an interpretation. So the simulation is not based on reality, but based on your always deficient model. Your model that is inevitably deficient because it's an interpretation that can't take every aspect into account. And thereby it becomes its own thing, a reality that we take as reality, but that is only simulacrum.
But before you reach simulacrum, there's this idea that it masks the absence of a basic reality.
Yeah. How are you reading that? Because to me, what that says is that we would feel the absence of the reality, but the simulation doesn't allow us to do that.
Okay, so it doesn't allow us to do that, or maybe if we did feel that, we would start dissolving the simulation, if you will. If you're masking the absence of a basic reality, that doesn't mean that there is no basic reality at all.
Mm-hmm.
Necessarily, what it could mean is that you've lost touch with basic reality.
Yeah.
So it's just like the idea, the way that he's putting it, that, well, what if God himself can be simulated? Then, of course, if God is the guarantor of how the signs can be exchanged for meaning, your guarantor is a counterfeit.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that your guarantor is a counterfeit doesn't mean that there is no guarantor.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if that's the way that Baudrillard is thinking about it, but that's a viable reading to me, and it makes sense that way.
There's a certain way in which I think people look at something like simulacrum, and that it's almost like something that comes from the realization of the contingency of everything, like the underlying nothing of it all. Right?
Mm.
But I think it's really interesting to look at the process of representation and concealment and loss of reality and question whether or not it's really just a matter of you having been imprisoned in something that maybe you were complicit in the construction of, or maybe it's also just kind of like the process of what your civilization is constructing.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's why it's all the more persuasive that reality is a simulation, because it feels like a simulation. And then ultimately comes to the point of it actually being a simulacrum, which ends up having the feeling that this is all that there is.
Right.
But if the progression, the way that we're discussing it now, does take place with the representation, it's more like we've just created this prison for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that you agreed with me where I said maybe one of the appeals of simulation theory is the idea that death itself will be simulated.
Yeah.
Because people are trying to avoid death.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to me that the civilization that we've created, the culture that we're immersed in now, is to a large degree based on the denial of death.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm saying, yeah, like especially with America in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also thinking, especially with Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood. I'll leave that for the Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
So I just have one last thing. I was reminded of this when watching the 13th Floor the other week. The conversation that Douglas has with Jane Fuller. I'll just read the conversation. It was your user. He downloaded into you, manipulated you. Like a puppet. A puppet doesn't have a soul. I can't have a soul any more than Fuller. But you do. There's just one little flaw in your thesis. None of this is real. You pull the plug, I disappear. And nothing I ever say, nothing I ever do will ever matter. And then he says, you can't fall in love with a dream.
I was going to say, most people I know, that's all they ever fall in love with.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's another simulation. So I kind of want to look at whether, Douglas is right or wrong. Like, is his reality unreal because the people the people a level above him in the simulation could just pull the plug so his life doesn't matter and all of that? Her world is a simulation too, so they're in the same boat. But I mean, I want to talk about whether the simulation is different from the reality. And the way I thought to take a look at that, the tack I chose to use is Leibniz identity of indiscernibles. I just grabbed a definition from Wikipedia. The identity of indiscernibles is an ontological principle that states that there cannot be separate objects or entities that have all their properties in common. That is, entities X and Y are identical if every predicate possessed by X is also possessed by Y and vice versa. To suppose two things indiscernible is to suppose the same thing under two names.
Well, I have a question. Would location...
Yeah, that's that's one of the first things that I thought of when bringing this up. And I would have to say that location doesn't actually matter. It's not an intrinsic property of the entity. So, like in the 13th Floor, on the one hand, Douglas, he makes an important distinction that his maker could just pull the plug on his world. But would that make it not indiscernible from our reality? I mean, if there is a God, couldn't God just pull the plug on ours? Are the reality and the simulation indiscernible? I thought that was a good question to ask. Especially when we're talking about something like Bostrom in relation to the 13th Floor, where maybe you actually have to create every, you have to recreate every hadron or whatever. Then is there a difference?
One way of thinking about it is that Douglas actually ends up going into the world that David is from. So in that case, if the plug were pulled on the simulation that Douglas came from, Douglas would nevertheless continue to exist.
Right.
So is Douglas's existence actually truly dependent on that simulation?
Right. Given that you can make those movements. I mean, like, theoretically speaking, right, if we assume that there can be a simulated reality that is indiscernible from reality, then with Leibniz here, there would be an identity between the two, right? And I think what we could take from what you're saying is that that's something that actually makes them discernible. If we're living in, the top level reality, then we actually can't escape upward when they turn the lights out here.
Right. But just to be clear, if you actually do connect this to the holarchy, there is no top-level reality.
Right. Yeah, you kind of have to be careful when talking about the 13th Floor, whether it's the holarchy metaphor, where, there is no top level, or, with the simulations. I mean, maybe with Baudrillard, you could say that it's just all simulations. But when thinking about, computer simulations, like, there pretty much has to be a top level where, someone's actually running the hardware.
Right, 100%. 100%, the way you're talking about a hypervisor and then all these kind of virtual machines. But going into what we were talking about earlier, you take that whole, you essentially take the building in the 13th floor, and the idea being there are other floors and other realities, and turn it on its side with respect to the holarchy and say this is like all on the same ontological level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then there is a kind of a certain point that you can get to. Maybe that point would actually be where you could, in a sense, reach the sweet spot, and then there'd be no way to go further within the context of that movement, which was all on the same level anyway, but maybe you could go upward, but it would be going upward in the holarchy, which would be different from progressing through worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is kind of, I think, what I was getting at, and you seem somewhat sympathetic to, with a relationship, a kind of communion, and a realization of agency as well, part of that being able to navigate through these worlds, that in some sense makes it a romantic film.
Right. And then there's just one problem I have with that in the movie, and that's when Jane Fuller talks about David downloading into Douglas, and Douglas calls himself a puppet. That argument is pretty hard to defeat, because it's like, no, you're fine, you're real. But, people from a world above yours will use your body a few hours a week to have sex with prostitutes.
Right. Well, okay, so those people who are using your body are seeking what? Agency. They're using you as a tool. So, and then the problem with you is that you're in an inferior position in a hierarchy because someone can use you as an avatar. So I see that as a kind of dominance hierarchy that exists in that system that is depicted in the 13th floor. In a similar manner, we have dominance hierarchies that exist, in our society, and we have to function within those hierarchies.
Yeah. If I were to make a sequel, I would have Douglas realize all of the points that we're making, and it would become a race upward, so that you're trying to climb the dominance hierarchy. You're trying to go higher than the guy that is trying to download into you and have you engage in raunchy, disgusting sex or whatever.
Or murder.
Yeah. And then, subtextually, you would have this idea of trying to climb the higher rungs of the ladder of the holarchy and so on.
Right. So, I mean, theoretically, what you could do is if you could actually increase your agency while also increasing the quality of your being, then you wouldn't be making the same use of those who are nested deeper within. Because theoretically, wherever he is, he could possess someone and use them as an avatar, and then, even in that person, possess someone else in another world and use them as an avatar, and have all kinds of depraved adventures.
Right.
But you're talking about him not wanting to do that.
Right. I mean, like, that's this.
Doesn't it seem like in the indulgence that people were able to follow, they were in some sense being driven mad by the indulgence, or by the possibility of the indulgence?
Yeah.
Because I feel like that goes back to that quote that Zizek loves. One is, I think, Dostoyevsky. There's like the Dostoyevsky version or the Lacan version. One is like, if God doesn't exist, anything is possible. And the other one is, if God doesn't exist, nothing is possible.
Yeah.
And there's definitely different levels of interpretation of that. But one is, even if it becomes possible to act in all these ways, the consuming insanity will destroy you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a new thought. Once we have the revelation, right, that the 2024 world is a simulation, then it seems like a user in 2024 could download into a person in 1995 and then use the 13th floor device to download into a person in 1937. So you would have this kind of nested simulation thing going on. And there's something to it that, like I think you mentioned, that the whole thing just keeps going further and further into the past.
Right.
And I think you could even bring in, the past-future distinction for what you're saying, that like these self-destructive behaviors are about going into the past. And if you just leave all that behind, leave the jumping into simulations for depravity or whatever, and you just start going up the system, then you'll be going towards the future and maybe unlocking more of the potentials of yourself, of humanity. There could be like that kind of distinction with past and future and self-destructive depravity and transcendence.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, if you look at the phases that Baudrillard describes, where he talks it's a reflection of a basic reality, it masks and perverts a basic reality, it masks the absence of a basic reality, it bears no relation to any reality. Well, I mean, we've talked about reality tunnels. Human beings are living in tunnels that they construct with their minds. And of course, their minds are being conditioned by the culture that they're immersed in. So there are certain kinds of similarities between people's reality tunnels so that people can kind of reach a consensus and meet each other at a nexus of their tunnels, so to speak. But for some people, it's more difficult, right? Because their worldviews are so different. Maybe their tunnels can't really meet, right? I mean, maybe people can just be overwhelmed by their own projections. I think it's interesting to think about this whole process, not just in terms of whether, we're all living in a simulation or if it's an actual simulacrum or it's a reflection of a basic reality, but that actually these stages, I think, pertain to people's actual personal reality tunnels. And that the truth is that there are all kinds of people are going like at different points in these stages all the time, and that you're actually interacting with people that are different points in these stages, which might even be in some sense analogous to kind of the different worlds of Buddhism.
Yeah.
Whether someone's a hungry ghost or, in the realm of the gods or what have you. So even if a person were in a simulation, they know they're in one of those simulated worlds in the 13th floor. Their experience of reality is very different from someone who's in one of those simulations and doesn't know that it's a simulation. And also very different from someone who is also jumping from simulations but to engage in the kind of depravity that we're talking about. So it's really kind of beginning with you as an individual and kind of what impressions you're choosing and really how you're navigating through all this. Because all of this is a mystery. And there are layers and layers and layers. But if it is a hell, then I think it was Winston Churchill, if you're going through hell, keep going.
Yeah, well, I like that you brought in reality tunnels. It is indeed like reality itself is in many ways comprised of multiple levels of simulations. The mental worlds that we construct being one of those. The changes in thought and behavior brought about by trauma being another example. What they have incorrect as well as correct in the consensus reality. There are all these things that kind of shape or co-shape reality, and at least in the Eastern thought sense of samsara, all of that is basically inside of a simulation, right? And the absolute reality that we can apprehend exists, but it's only by going through samsara that we can get there. I guess that makes Winston Churchill a Buddhist.
So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.